Murdered, a podcast. I'm your host, AB. And this week on Mama Murdered, a podcast, in honor of Halloween, I figured what better case to talk about than the tragic case of the monstrous dad who killed Halloween. Ronald Clark O'Bryan. Ronald was arrested, charged, convicted, and eventually executed for the cyanide poisoning of some Halloween candy that resulted with the almost instant death of his young son, Timothy. So this case involves a real piece of work, and with all that being said, and without further ado, always remember to check your kids' candy. And with that, let's get it. But before we jump right into this case, let me just preface this by saying that the number of cases of kids getting Halloween candy that is laced with drugs is extremely, extremely low. And I'll tell you why. Because no one is wasting their good drugs on your kids. And I'm saying that with my whole chest. Let me say it again for the people in the back. No one is wasting their good drugs on you, your kids, or their Halloween candy. It is very, 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 very unlikely that someone is lacing Halloween candy with fentanyl, meth, cocaine, cyanide, or any other hard-to-get and extremely expensive drugs. So this case is so extremely unlikely to happen to your children, and even less likely that if it does happen, that it would be done by a complete stranger. Of course, always check the candy that your kids get from trick-or-treat, trunk-or-treat, or whatever other events that your family goes to when they celebrate Halloween, if you celebrate Halloween in your house. Just keep in mind that the chances of someone wasting their good drugs to put in Halloween candy is very, very unlikely. Now, let's do a quick rundown on the O'Bryan family that we're going to be talking about today. Ronald Clark O'Bryan and his wife Danae lived in Deer Park, Texas, which is right outside of Houston, Texas, and they lived in Deer Park, which A&E described as a middle-class suburb, with their two kids. Their two kids were 8-year-old Timothy O'Bryan, who was born in 1966, and their daughter Elizabeth, who was just 5 years old and was born in 1969. Ronald worked as an optician or an eye doctor, if you're my kind of people, and he was described as a quote-unquote above-average dad, which I'm assuming for the 1970s would be a pretty high compliment. Ronald was also a deacon at the family's Baptist church, where Ronald also sang in their church's choir. Everyone who knew Ronald would describe him as a good Christian man, a good friend, a decent husband, and a good role model. So far, Ronald sounds like kind of a catch. But his career as an eye doctor seemed sketchy at best. According to A&E and everything else I've read about Ronald O'Bryan, he wasn't really good at holding down a job. That wasn't really his best quality. He had actually been employed by 21 different companies over the course of a 10-year period. So that's not great. That's usually at least some kind of red flag. And Ronald hadn't just quit all of these different jobs. He had been fired from all of them for either fraudulent behavior or for negligence. But in 1974, by the fall of that year, Ronald was on thin ice again with his current employer and was on the verge of being fired yet again from his job. Ronald had been accused of stealing from his current employer, which was the Texas State Optical. And because Ronald couldn't hold down a job, this had the family in a little bit of a tough spot as far as finances go. Now, at the time in 1974, Ronald was 30 years old and his weekly salary was about $150 after taxes and stuff were taken out. So, with an inflation calculator, I figured up what would be the equivalent of $150 from 1974 to 2023. So if we were going off of what the dollar is worth in 2023, Ronald would have been making somewhere around $936 a week, so that at least seems like a decent paycheck every week. But Ronald's $150 a week was barely enough to cover the family's rent, let alone groceries and other utilities. The family was eventually forced to have to sell their house in Deer Park, and they had to move into a smaller apartment. Also, the O'Brien's family car was, unbeknownst to anyone besides Ronald, on the brink of being repossessed. And Ronald had also missed several loan payments and defaulted on several bank loans. And we would later find out that Ronald O'Bryan had accumulated around about $100,000 in debt, which $100,000 sounds like a lot of money even now, today in 2023, but with inflation, the conversion from $100,000 in 1974 would be the equivalent to around about $624,000 in today's money, as far as how much the dollar is worth now versus then. So all of this seems pretty normal as of now. A lot of families go through rough patches and eventually have some kind of financial problems. So this may have you wondering, how does a family's debt and an eye doctor who can't keep a job lead to the murder of an 8-year-old boy? Well, picture it. It's Halloween night and we're in 1974. Ronald and his wife Danae and their 2 kids, Timothy and Elizabeth, were going to a friend's house for dinner. These family friends are the Bates family, and the Bates family lived in Pasadena, so not too far from where the O'Briens were living. The O'Brien family and the Bates family were planning to go trick-or-treating together after they'd finished eating dinner together. And from my understanding of the situation, it seems like the Bates family had kind of invited the O'Briens to dinner to try to just help them out. Like maybe the Bates were trying to just help their friends out by inviting them over for a dinner that would have been free to the O'Briens. And if you've never done this for a friend before, are you even really their friend? It would be a situation where you know that they don't have the money to afford to get dinner one night, so you just invite them over and feed them for free. This is essentially what the Bates family was doing for the O'Briens from the way I understood it. Once the Bates family and the O'Brien family finished up dinner together, Ronald and the Bates family kids' dad, Jim Bates, agreed to walk the kids and take them trick-or-treating. Little 8-year-old Timothy O'Brien was dressed in a Planet of the Apes costume, and his little sister, 5-year-old Elizabeth O'Brien, was dressed as a little princess. Jim Bates also took both of his kids trick-or-treating with Ronald and his 2 kids, so both dads walked around the neighborhood with all 4 kids. But it was drizzling rain on this night, so they really only hit a handful of houses, and if you've ever taken 4 or more small children trick-or-treating at one time, then you know that they tend to be ready to give up on having to walk themselves around fairly quickly. So during this short walk around the neighborhood, Ronald, Jim, and all 4 kids knocked on the door of one of the houses. But the house that they knocked on the door of had their lights off, and we all know this is kind of the universal sign for we ran out of candy or we didn't buy candy anyways. So when no one came to the door, Jim and all 4 of the kids kind of made their way to the next house. This is when Jim noticed that Ronald had kind of fallen behind him and the kids, and he may have only been a house or 2 behind, but he was still behind. Ronald ended up coming up to Jim and the kids holding 5 massive Pixie Stix, and from what Ronald said, the house that they had just knocked on the door of that had their lights off, someone had eventually come to the door after the kids had walked off. And whoever had answered the door had handed Ronald 5 huge Pixie Stix. Now, for anyone listening outside of the U.S., or to anyone that may not know what a Pixie Stix is, it's basically just a tube filled with flavored colored sugar. There are blue ones that taste like blue raspberry, red ones that taste like cherry or strawberry, purple ones that taste like grape, and so on and so forth. But essentially, it's literally just flavored sugar in a tube. And you can get these in one of 2 ways. They either come in a smaller paper tube filled with colored flavored sugar, or the bigger ones come in a plastic tube that are also filled with colored flavored sugar. Now, the big Pixie Stix that come in a plastic tube are usually somewhere between 16 to 24 inches long. So either way you slice it, that would be a whole lot of colored flavored sugar. So the Pixie Stix that come in the plastic tube that range from 16 to 24 inches long would be about the equivalent of finding the house that gives out the full-size candy bars. That's how big these Pixie Stix were. And I'll post a picture on social media of the Pixie Stix that I'm talking about so that everyone can visualize what I'm saying if you have no idea. Now, Ronald had made it back to Jim and the 4 kids holding 5 of these giant Pixie Stix. He gave 2 of them to his own kids, Timothy and Elizabeth. He also gave 2 to Jim Bates's kids. And then Ronald ran into a boy that he knew from church, and Ronald gave this boy from church the very last massive Pixie Stix that he had. So Ronald and Jim finished up trick-or-treating with their 4 kids, and once Ronald and his wife Danae got back to their house, it was bedtime, and everybody had already eaten dinner earlier in the night with the Bates family before they'd gone trick-or-treating. So, of course, when the kids get back home, they're rummaging through their candy buckets, and Ronald tells both Timothy and Elizabeth that they can each choose one piece of candy to eat before bed. But then he suggests that maybe they should both eat those huge Pixie Stix that he had gotten from the house with the lights off. And even without knowing anything else about this case, what parent is letting their child choose one piece of candy before bed and then suggesting to their child that the one piece of candy be 16 to 24 inches of straight-up colored flavored sugar? I don't know many parents who would be suggesting their kids eat that one huge piece of sugar right before bedtime. Like, I feel like most parents let their kids choose a few pieces of candy to eat before bed after they come home from trick-or-treating, and we just all kind of pray to whatever we believe in that those kids choose the smallest pieces in the bucket. But that's not what Ronald did. He suggested that both of his kids eat these massive tubes of sugar as their one piece of candy before bedtime. Like, that's not weird at all, Ronald. That's not weird at all. Now, 5-year-old Elizabeth decided that she didn't want to eat her huge Pixie Stix right now. She was going to save hers for later. But 8-year-old Timothy was just like, okay, bet. So give me my giant tube of sugar then, please, Dad. So Timothy couldn't get the Pixie Stix opened because the top of the tube was stapled shut. So Ronald used either his pocket knife or a pair of scissors. I've seen both things in multiple places during this research. Either way, he used one of those to cut the tops open where the staple was sealing the package closed. Timothy dumped a mouthful of the colored sugar into his mouth, and as soon as Timothy started to swallow the sugar, he immediately made a face and told Ronald that the sugar didn't taste right and that it was kind of bitter tasting. Ronald makes a cup of Kool-Aid and takes it into Timothy and tells him to wash the sugar down. So Timothy's got this mouthful of sugar, and Ronald's like shoving Kool-Aid down his throat to get him to swallow it to try to get the taste out of his mouth. And it is literal minutes later when Timothy is doubled over on the floor, crying in pain. He's vomiting, his little body's shaking violently, he's gasping for air, and then his body eventually goes limp. When Timothy made it to the hospital, he had sadly already passed away less than 1 hour after ingesting the Pixie Stix candy. He was pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital at about 10:30 p.m. on October 31st, 1974. Ronald later recalled the night that Timothy passed away, and he told police, quote, 30 seconds after I left Tim's room, I heard him cry to me, Daddy, Daddy, my stomach hurts. He was in the bathroom, convulsing, vomiting, and gasping, and then he suddenly went limp. Now, Timothy's body was taken to the medical examiner's office where an autopsy was conducted. And during the autopsy, the medical examiner kept getting a whiff of what smelled like almonds coming from Timothy's mouth, which is one of the most common signs of cyanide poisoning, which is kind of wild to learn that cyanide smells like almonds because only 30 to 50% of people can actually detect the smell of almonds. So the chances that the medical examiner in this case could actually smell the almonds at all is just pure luck. But once the autopsy was done on Timothy, it was found that Timothy had consumed enough cyanide to kill 2 to 3 grown-ass men. And keep in mind that Timothy had only eaten 1 mouthful of the powdered sugar in the Pixie Stix, so how much cyanide was really in that entire tube? If 1 mouthful had enough cyanide to kill 2 or 3 grown men, there had to have been a ton of cyanide in that tube. So obviously, Timothy's cause of death would go on to be listed as cyanide poisoning. And once police had a cause of death, there was an instant panic within the community Because as far back as the legend of some stranger poisoning Halloween candy goes, there had actually never been a case of that happening. And even the New York Times had written an article about candy being tampered with and somehow being poisoned in 1970, even though it had never actually happened. This was very much an urban legend before Ronald O'Bryan. But Ronald was able to point police in the direction of the other kids that had gotten the other 4 Pixie Stix, and we already know that Ronald's daughter Elizabeth hadn't eaten her Pixie Stix yet, so police were able to get that one from Elizabeth O'Bryan. So from here, the police head to the Bates family home, and luckily the Bates kids also hadn't eaten their Pixie Stix that night either. So now they only had one more Pixie Stix that they needed to find. Police had already found the other 3, plus the one that Timothy had eaten. So the kid from the church was the only one that police knew for sure that they needed to recover this Pixie Stix from. Now, of course, police have no idea if there may be any other kind of candy that could have been tampered with, and there really would have been no way to know as of right now in the timeline. So at the moment, police are just trying to make sure that they recover all 5 of those giant Pixie Stix. So police go to the house where the boy from church lived, because remember, Ronald had given 2 of the Pixie Stix to his own kids, 2 of the other Pixie Stix to the Bates family kids, and then he had given one to a kid that he knew from church where he was a deacon. So Whitney Parker was the boy from church, and when police get to the Parker house where the boy from church lived, they found little Whitney Parker in his bed asleep, still clutching this giant Pixie Stick in his hand. See, Whitney Parker, who knew Ronald from church, had tried to get the Pixie Stix opened before he went to bed, but because the staple had been used to seal the sugar tube back up, he wasn't able to get it opened before he fell asleep with it in his hand. So once police took all 4 of the other Pixie Stix to be tested, all 4 of them also contained an absurd amount of cyanide. And I don't care how you look at it, really, but the fact that all 4 of these other kids had gotten those Pixie Stix and had not eaten them has to be some kind of divine intervention. Because there was enough cyanide in each Pixie Stix to kill multiple grown adults. And it was just by pure chance that Whitney Parker, who was the kid from church, could not get the tube open to be able to eat it. Now, it was the very next morning after Timothy had passed away that Ronald contacted his insurance agency about a life insurance policy that he had taken out on both of his kids. And Ronald was asking how and what he needed to do in order to go ahead and collect the life insurance money for Timothy's death, which, red flags, red flags. Now, the same morning after Timothy had passed away from cyanide poisoning, police had asked Ronald to walk with them around the neighborhood that he and Jim Bates had taken the kids trick-or-treating in to try to point out the house that had given Ronald these Pixie Stix to start with. But after they walked around for a while, Ronald told police that he really couldn't remember which house it had been that he had gotten them from. This is when Ronald told police what he did remember, though. And Ronald says that he didn't remember what the man looked like because he hadn't actually seen the man's face who had given him the Pixie Stix that he had given to the kids. Ronald said that the kids had knocked on this door of this house where the porch light was off, and when no one answered the door, the kids and Jim Bates kept walking to the next house, but Ronald stuck behind. And after a few seconds, that someone did finally open the door, but that whoever had opened the door had just stuck their arm out and handed Ronald 5 giant Pixie Stix. Ronald remembered that he assumed it was a man that had stuck his arm out of the door with the Pixie Stix because Ronald said that he remembered the arm that handed him the candy being really hairy. So Ronald is claiming that there was nothing more than an arm sticking out of the door and that the arm was pretty hairy, and also that he doesn't remember what house it had been. So this story that Ronald is spinning is already starting to fall apart, and we're only about 24 hours after Timothy's death. Now, police had already informed the public about the cyanide poisoning in the candy, and parents from all over were taking their kids' bucket of candy that they kids had gotten trick-or-treating to the police station and dropping them off. Hospitals were offering to x-ray bags and buckets of candy if parents would bring them in so that they could make sure that there weren't any razor blades in anything or needles in anything. And people are freaking out, and rightfully so. But nobody in the public had realized that they were fearing a stranger attack, which, sadly, isn't at all what this was. Timothy's funeral was held on November 2nd, 1974, at the Forest Park Cemetery. At his funeral services, Ronald sang his son a church hymn, and the singing at the funeral had everyone in the crowd at the funeral in tears and crying. At this point, everyone is grieving the sudden death of an 8-year-old Timothy, and people in the community are sympathizing with Ronald and his wife Danae, and no one had a clue yet that Ronald had caused his own son's death, and that he'd done it intentionally, and that it was very much premeditated. But there were some people who noticed that something was off with Ronald at the funeral. They may not have known exactly what was going on with Ronald at the funeral service, but they felt like there was just something off about the way Ronald was acting. Jim Bates, who was the friend that had gone with Ronald to take the kids trick-or-treating, had noticed that Ronald seemed to be avoiding or even acknowledging that there was a casket in the room with Timothy's body in it. And Jim Bates even says that at one point, Ronald walked right into the casket like he didn't even see that it was there, even though the casket had been there for the entire service. It was almost like Ronald couldn't see the casket in the room at all, which is weird at the very least. Now, there was a station on TV that were going to be airing the video recording of Ronald singing at Timothy's funeral, and after the funeral, there were family members that remembered that Ronald got really upset and annoyed with everybody for not wanting to stay up late and watch him sing at his son's funeral because they had all been there and saw Ronald sing in person at the actual funeral services. They didn't want to watch it on TV on the same day that they had just laid this baby to rest. And they're all still in the early stages of the grieving process, so it's almost like Ronald got mad or upset at them for not wanting to watch his performance again. Kind of like Ronald needed this entire thing to be about him, and now he's upset with everyone else that they're more worried about remembering Timothy and not remembering the song that Ronald sang at Timothy's funeral. I don't know, it's just strange. Ronald seemed to like the praise that he'd gotten when he'd sang the song at the funeral, and like he wanted to relive it again and again, which actually makes a whole lot of sense the more you learn about Ronald. Now, on November 3rd and 4th, the police are finally starting to see through Ronald's bullshit, and this in turn makes him a pretty good suspect. Ronald still hasn't been able to point out which house it was that he'd gotten the Pixie Stix from, and this seems kind of weird because even Ronald himself told police that they had only gone down 2 streets to trick-or-treat that night on Halloween. Because again, it was drizzling rain, the kids were small, they were tired, so that really narrows down which house it could have been that had given him the Pixie Stix. So police take Ronald down the same 2 roads that he had taken the kids trick-or-treating down again, except this time, Ronald does point out the house that had no lights on that he had stopped at with his kids and Jim Bates and Jim's 2 kids. So when Ronald points this house out, it turns out that a man by the name of Courtney Mellon is the one that lived in this house. Now, Courtney Mellon was actually sitting outside on the porch, so naturally, this man is now the prime suspect. They have Ronald pointing directly at this man saying, "That's him, that's the house that gave me the poisoned candy." So, of course, police had some questions for Mr. Mellon, and on November 4th, 1974, Courtney Mellon was actually arrested in connection to Timothy's death, and he was arrested at work in front of tons of his co-workers. But after police take Courtney Mellon in for questioning, they soon learn that his alibi is as solid as they come. You see, Courtney Mellon worked as an air traffic control at an airport, and he was working on the night of Halloween when Ronald said that he'd supposedly gotten the tainted Pixie Stix. Courtney Mellon was seen by well over 100 different people and co-workers throughout the night of Halloween. So this basically gives Courtney Mellon a rock-solid alibi, which can only mean one thing. That this story that Ronald is trying to spin is falling apart one lie at a time. Courtney Mellon was not only spotted by hundreds of people at his job and all throughout his shift at work on the night of Halloween, but his time cards also matched his alibi as well. So police were able to pretty quickly rule Courtney Mellon out as a suspect, and now they're back to looking at Ronald for the murder of his son Timothy. So now maybe the police shouldn't have jumped the gun and arrested Courtney Mellon at work in front of a bunch of his co-workers, but this is 4 days after Timothy's murder, and the entire community is in a constant state of panic. Everyone wants the monster who's responsible for Timothy's death to be arrested and taken off the streets, but the police probably should have done a little more digging before they went straight in to arrest this man. But in the same breath, I can see why they did jump the gun. The police and the public don't know if these were the only candies that were poisoned, or if there's also chocolate bars and Twizzlers and Rice Krispie treats that were also laced with cyanide. I mean, no one knows if it was only those 5 Pixie Stix that had been poisoned. But since Ronald had pointed out the house where absolutely no one had been home at, and then said that this was where he had gotten the poison candy from, this led police to arrest Ronald on November 5th, 1974. Ronald Clark O'Bryan was charged with 4 counts of attempted murder for the 4 Pixie Stix that had been given to the Bates children, Ronald's own children, and the little boy from church. But Ronald was also charged with 1 count of capital murder as well for the death of his own son, Timothy O'Bryan. And again, the police were pretty quick to make this arrest, except this time they arrested Ronald. Why? Well, because police had been doing some digging of their own, and they uncovered the mounds of debt that the O'Bryan family was in, but they also learned about the absolutely absurd amount of life insurance policies that Ronald had taken out on his kids. And police had also pieced it together that Ronald had upped the life insurance amount just 1 month before Timothy's death on Halloween night. But police are also having to keep a lot of different things in mind, like how Ronald said that he had been the one to hand out these 5 Pixie Stix, but that at first Ronald couldn't remember which house he'd gotten them from, but then he did remember which house it had been, except, turns out, absolutely no one was home when the candy was given out that night. So none of these little stories are adding up from Ronald, at all. So before we go any further, let's jump back just a little bit to January of 1974 for a minute. So this would have been 10 months before Timothy passed away. So in January of 1974, Ronald had contacted a company for life insurance on his 2 kids, Timothy and Elizabeth. Now, he had taken out 2 life insurance policies that were for $10,000 per child. So, if, God forbid, something were to happen to both of his kids at the same time, Ronald would have stood to gain about $20,000, which seems like chump change when you're talking about what your kids' lives are worth, and then attaching a dollar amount to their lives. But then again, with the help of my handy-dandy conversion calculator, I figured up what $20,000 in 1974 would be the equivalence of in today's money. And it would have been almost $130,000. And of course, again, that's just with the way the dollar amount has changed from 1974 to now. So while $20,000 isn't a ton of money, $130,000 is a much bigger chunk of change, which is essentially what the $20,000 would have been worth in 1974. So that's basically what both of his kids were worth to Ronald. And I get being a responsible adult and having life insurance on everybody in your house just to cover the cost of funeral expenses, if nothing else. But taking out huge life insurance policies on kids isn't something that happens all the time. Like I mentioned, usually parents only take out life insurance policies on their kids to have enough to cover the cost of expenses for a funeral if, God forbid, something were to happen to their kids. Or even if your child has some kind of terminal illness or, life-threatening disease, then I could see life insurance would be a logical thing. Still heartbreaking and awful, but children do pass away. So, but these large lump sums of life insurance policies seem super suspicious for the most part, except for those few exceptions. But let's play devil's advocate here for a minute. Life insurance policies cost money, and the O'Briens were already struggling with money and not able to pay their bills. And neither of their kids were terminally ill or expected to pass away anytime soon for whatever reason. So why would Ronald need these large lump sum life insurance policies on his kids when they truly could not afford it to start with? So that happened in January of 1974, but then in September of 1974, just 1 month before Timothy O'Bryan was murdered, Ronald had taken out an additional $20,000 worth of insurance policies on both 8-year-old Timothy and 5-year-old Elizabeth, making the grand total that Ronald would have received had his attempt to murder both of his children worked would have been about $60,000. That was in 1974. So the same amount in today's money would have been worth almost $400,000. Yeah. So Ronald would have stood to gain about $400,000 had his plan to kill both kids and collect their life insurance policies worked, which is a huge, huge payout for a life insurance policy, but especially on kids. Why would you ever need $400,000 of life insurance on a literal child? I can't think of any reason besides your child being terminally ill or having been diagnosed with some serious life-threatening things. That's really the only reason that I can make that make sense as to why you would need that much life insurance on a child. Now, something else to take note of is that Ronald's life insurance agent did advise him against needing this much life insurance on otherwise healthy kids. Something else that we would learn after the trial is that Ronald's wife, Danae, didn't even know about the second life insurance policies that Ronald had taken out on both of their kids. She did know about the first one for $10,000, and even that one, she had told Ronald that she really didn't think they needed it and that they really couldn't afford it. So the second life insurance policies that Ronald had taken out for $20,000 on both kids, she had no idea about. Something else that we wouldn't find out until later on during this investigation is that Ronald had actually called the life insurance agency on the morning of Halloween before Timothy ever died, and he just had a few questions. You want to guess what those questions that Ronald was asking were? Well, good, because I'm going to tell you. Ronald was calling his life insurance agency to ask what he would need to do in order to collect his life insurance policies on his kids if, just by off chance, if something were to happen to them. This is just real weird timing, especially considering what we know now about these life insurance policies and about how Timothy was actually killed. And police were able to uncover some other things at the O'Bryan house that also pointed the finger directly at Ronald. They found an adding machine tape, which is those calculators that print out like a small receipt of whatever you're adding or subtracting. And on this adding machine tape, Ronald had added up all of his bills and debts together. And what would you know? It's almost the exact same amount that Ronald would have gotten if he had been able to cash in those life insurance policies. That's weird. You gotta say it. That's weird. Police also found a pocket knife or scissors. Like I mentioned earlier, I saw both. But these scissors and or knife had residue on them that matched the residue from the tainted Pixie Stix. So this piece of evidence was what we would call the smoking gun. This pocket knife or pair of scissors, whichever it may have been, had residue from the plastic tube that the Pixie Stix came in. They also found trace amounts of cyanide on them as well. So, like I said, smoking gun. And then police learned some even more interesting news. Ronald had been taking classes at the local community college, and once he was arrested, Ronald's professor came forward to inform the police that Ronald had been asking him a lot of questions about whether or not there was a more powerful substance besides cyanide that would kill somebody quickly. Ronald had also asked his professor things like, what's more lethal than cyanide? So, none of this is really looking good for Ronald. But the one thing that probably looked the worst for Ronald out of all of the dumb shit that he did was when police learned that Ronald had gone to multiple different chemical companies asking about what he would need to do to go about ordering cyanide. And since Ronald was an eye doctor, I guess the people that worked at these chemical companies didn't really think much about him coming in asking how to order cyanide. I don't know. You would just think that would have thrown up some kind of red flags for the people that worked at these chemical companies, but I guess not. And from my understanding, Ronald was told by multiple different companies that he would have to order at least a minimum of 5 pounds of cyanide. So I'm still actually pretty confused on how he ended up getting his hands on cyanide to start with. And I would just assume that cyanide and most other chemicals like that were just more readily available back in the 70s. But, maybe they just weren't that hard to get. I have no idea. Police also gave Ronald a lie detector test, and I am in no way defending this shitbag, and I know this case was in 1974, but I am genuinely curious as to why police still give people lie detector tests, even though we know that they're not accurate, and even though we know that we can't use them in court. But for whatever reason, police do still use this technique. Now, after he fails his polygraph test, Ronald doesn't just drop his head and admit guilt, and actually, you'll soon find out, Ronald dies claiming his innocence. So, instead of taking a plea deal or just confessing to his actions, Ronald opts for a jury trial instead. And his trial started on May 5th, 1975. And Ronald goes into this trial and enters a plea of not guilty. And he even stuck to his original story that a man with a hairy arm had given him Pixie Stix at a house where nobody was home. The trial lasted until June 3rd, 1975, so it was almost a month long. And all of this could have been avoided if Ronald would have just admitted to what he had done. So the jury had almost an entire month to listen to and believe the lies that Ronald was spewing. And still, it only took the jury a whopping 46 minutes to deliberate and find Ronald Clark O'Bryan guilty on all 5 charges. And when it came to Ronald's sentencing, that also took absolutely no time. It took the jury 76 minutes to decide that Ronald would be sentenced to death by electric chair, because this is Texas, and Texas has no problem handing out executions. So, after almost a month-long trial, it took the jury a whole ass 122 minutes to decide that Ronald was not only guilty, but that he would also be executed. That's gotta be some kind of record. Now, even after Ronald went to trial and got his death sentence, he still never folded and took responsibility for what happened to his son Timothy. Instead, Ronald filed 8 different appeals to try to get his conviction overturned, and all 8 times, Ronald's appeals were denied. And these appeals could have done a few different things for Ronald. They could have, of course, overturned his conviction, but the jury members on all of these appeal cases could have also decided they wanted to change his sentence to something different, like maybe life in prison without the possibility of parole. But in all 8 appeals, his conviction stayed the same and his sentencing also stayed the same. So, all 8 of these different juries all decided over the course of 10 years that Ronald tried appealing his case that he did still deserve the death penalty, because all 8 of those appeals that took right at 10 years to complete, they all stayed with the same original sentencing and conviction. He was still to be executed. Now, in 1977, Texas adopted the lethal injection death penalty, citing that the electric chair was cruel and unusual punishment, which, I kind of agree. So, when Ronald's execution date rolled around on March 31st, 1984, Ronald was put to death by lethal injection, even though his original sentence was death by electric chair. And even on his deathbed, Ronald's last words make me want to throat punch a dead man. Right before his execution was carried out, Ronald's last words read as follows: "What is about to transpire in a few minutes is wrong. However, we as human beings do make mistakes and errors. This execution is one of those wrongs. Yet doesn't mean that our whole system of justice is wrong. Therefore, I would forgive all who have taken part in any way in my death. Also, to anyone I have offended in any way during my 39 years, I pray and ask your forgiveness, just as I have forgiven anyone who has offended me in any way. And I pray and ask God's forgiveness for us all, respectively, as human beings. To my loved ones, I extend my undying love. To those close to me, know you're in my hearts. I love you, one and all. God bless you all, and may God's blessings be always yours. Ronald C. O'Bryan. P.S. During my time here, I have been treated well by TDC personnel. So, all the way up until he was put to death, Ronald was still absolutely not taking responsibility for his actions and for the fact that he did in fact murder his own son. And I don't know about y'all, but that almost sounded like a pastor or preacher or deacon, something they would say to close out a Sunday morning church service. It sounds real super generic, real rehearsed, and absolutely no one cared what Ronald had to say anyways. Because there were almost 300 people standing outside of that Texas prison, screaming trick or treat and throwing candy into the air as Ronald O'Bryan was being executed. And at 12:38 a.m., Ronald Clark O'Bryan was dead and gone, and Timothy finally saw some kind of justice. The fact that Timothy lost his life because his dad couldn't get a grip on his spending habits is absolutely absurd. Timothy would have likely never been poisoned and killed had it not been for Ronald's own spending habits and the debt that Ronald had accumulated for his family. Now, Ronald's wife obviously filed for divorce after Ronald was arrested and charged, and she would later go on to marry a man who actually adopted Elizabeth O'Bryan, who was Ronald and Danae's other child. And this is the story of how one man killed Halloween. So take this as my one-time only reminder of the week. No one is wasting their good drugs on Halloween candy. That's all I have for you this week. Let's hear a review of the week. This review comes from Playin' for Pizza with a caption that says, "What a fantastic podcast, 5 stars." The review says, "I was told by a friend about this podcast and it was the best decision I've made about listening to a podcast. It's truly fantastic. If you're going to listen to a true crime podcast, this is it. It is truly a brilliant work of art. Highly recommended to all who love great research, a good story, and an awesome podcast. You won't be disappointed." Playin' for Pizza, you're fantastic. I love you guys so much. Let's do it again. Same time, same place, next Wednesday. See you then.
I got you because it's actually Tuesday. And for the love of God, make sure you still check your kids' candy because maybe there is someone crazy enough to waste their good drugs on your kids. Also, don't do drugs. Happy Halloween.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast.